All right, I think we'll begin. So good afternoon. My name is Jon Kramka, and I serve in this conference as the Director of Congregational Vitality. I've actually served in conference ministry for about 15 years, and in this capacity the last 5. But in my over 30 years of ministry, I have been deeply and regularly involved in a variety of compassion, mercy, and justice causes, ministries, and areas of work, both through organizations as well as through churches. I recognize that we all come here with varying degrees of both understanding for as well as involvement in this area of ministry. And someone has said, the church is more than the people of God, but the church is the people of God sent on mission. And this is one of the real missional markers of the set of 10 healthy missional markers of the church. And as covenanters, this is one that we continue to pursue and seek to live more deeply in both our understanding as well as our practice of. As God's people living and trying to be faithful in our living and service to the broader world. So I'm going to spend some time just trying to frame some principles, some values, and maybe some process that relate to congregations exploring, discerning, and living more into various compassion, mercy, and justice ministries. And then I hope towards the back end we're going to have a fair amount of time for just further conversation because I'm sure there's a wealth of knowledge in this room and there are things that we could gain from one another as we just invite ourselves in shared conversation around this important work of God's church. But to start with, as people of the book, I always like to start there as we have these conversations. And so I want to take us through a brief meditation on Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 42 and verse 44. And in this section, we recognize that at this point in the gospel, Jesus is moving around Galilee and he's preaching and he's teaching, driving out demons as he's interacting with the public along the road. And then we come to this text and we read these words. A man with leprosy comes to him and begs to him on his knees. If you are willing, you can make me clean. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cured. Now the first thing that I see embedded in this brief set of verses is the words, Jesus was filled with compassion. And for me, these words really capture God's heart for all of humanity. And this is always the posture that God takes towards the people that He has created and that He loves. Well, Marcus Borg wrote this book called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, and he makes this statement. For Jesus, compassion was the central quality of God, and therefore is to be the central moral quality of a life centered in God. I like that as just a standing reminder of part of the understanding of our call and our faith and God's hope for us as those who claim to be followers of His in the world and carrying out His kingdom purposes for Him in the world. Well, in addition, embedded in this little narrative, I think there's 4 principles that further frame for us an understanding of what I would refer to as godly compassion. The first principle that I think jumps out at us is just the fact that compassion always begins with a sense of awareness of our surroundings. that it calls us to constantly establish and maintain a posture of attentiveness to our context and surroundings and to those who we meet. In fact, I think godly compassion actually invites us to enter into human pain wherever it exists and to listen to its cry. And then I think we see Jesus demonstrating that so clearly here. The second principle, though, is it moves beyond just this sense of awareness, and compassion also moves us to a sense of feeling. We see in the text that we're told Jesus was filled with compassion. And so when Jesus saw this leopard, there literally was a visceral and an emotional response that swelled up within him. And obviously the marring impact of this disease upon this man gripped him deeply and moved him profoundly. David Frenchek puts it this way: seeing brokenness, discrimination, and marginalization among those around us actually should stir up within us, God's people, a sense of holy discontent. I like that term, holy discontent. That it moves us, it stirs us to a new wonder, a new place that's open to new possibility. But the reality is, this sense of awareness and this movement towards feeling really become the launching pad for compassion. Because compassion also calls us to action. And that was certainly true for Jesus here. Frenchek continues to build on this principle of holy discontent by saying this: holy discontent is being so brokenhearted about something that it causes you to do something to make a difference. Contrast this to discontent without holy, and it means you turn and walk away, or you get it out of your sight. Holy discontent is when we look around and say there's got to be something better or different that God desires or hopes for this situation. And He then invites us to move forward in the powering, the leading of His Spirit to set out and pursue that possibility for the situation that we're confronted with. Well, Jesus, we see in this little exchange, He does not hold back. Because we see that He actually responds to this man and He heals him. But then He does something in addition to this that we find in verse 44. Because this is what we read in verse 44. And He's now talking specifically to the leper. See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them. Now, why did Jesus instruct the leper to carry out this task? Well, I think it's because Jesus did not simply want to relieve the leper's pain, but He wanted to move the leper to a new place, even in the community. And what Jesus was referring to is the Levitical code, and the specific code here is found in the 14th chapter of Leviticus, where there was a provisional law called the ritual of purification. And He was inviting the leper to follow through with that procedure that was provided to him through the temple in order for this man not only to be healed, but also to be restored to the rightful place that was granted to him back into the community as he went through this purification process. So I think it's fair to say that godly compassion also moves us to levels of justice according to God's will and purposes. And it's moving people potentially from places of isolation, pain, alienation, marginalization, also back to the fuller place in the community that He desires for us all to experience. I think in many ways this is captured in the statement, experiencing the fullness of God. that He intends for all of humanity, and that this is in alignment with His plans and hopes for everyone, that we might know and experience this same kind of fullness that God has for us. But the reality is this. At times, we also know that the kingdom of God stands directly against human systems of the day. And this is also true, and I think it's embedded in this story. And it's why I say compassion also, at times, confronts culture and religion of the day. Because in the text, we also uniquely see that as Jesus was filled with compassion, we're told that He reaches out and touches the man as well. And we know that in first century Palestine, what was the status of lepers? Unclean. And they were outcasts. And Jewish law called them to be completely separated from the community. And anytime someone would touch a leper, what would be determined of that person? They were unclean as well. But I think consistent with Jesus' ministry and model, as He did His earthly ministry and people watched on, He always viewed with disdain whenever the law was applied in ungodly ways. You see, for Jesus, the law condensed down to its simplest form is always about God's love and the offering of reconciliation to the human community. Yet Jesus knew that in this moment that He stood, the whole religious and social establishment, they had believed that their posture towards this leper was actually right and actually required by God. So by touching the leper, I think Jesus is also calling into question the systems of this day regarding their understanding of what God was actually requiring of them as it related to lepers. And in many ways, Jesus' touch demonstrated that no one is outside of the grace and mercy of God's kingdom unless they reject it themselves. And I also think that based on Jesus' actions, therefore, compassion, moving to justice, at times also calls into account the very systems that are at play in the circumstance that human beings find themselves when they are outside of the boundaries of God's kingdom expectations and hopes for the world. Well, in closing, Chuck Swindoll, as he reflects on Matthew 25, he offers a final perspective that I offer to you on this theme of compassion. This is what Swindoll says in the book Start Where You Are. Christianity is seeing value in, loving and caring for, reaching out to, and spending time with the least of these. In a word, it's compassion. And these words in Matthew's account are saying in a nutshell, if Christianity is centered in Christ, and Christ is compassionate, then Christianity's finest expression is compassion. Now let me just pause and see if there's some other insights or reflections that any of you might offer as we just briefly considered this moment in Jesus' life and ministry. What are your thoughts?
He didn't let fear stop him from reaching out to that person.
Yeah.
You have to remember that he still was man and had all the same feelings that we do.
Excellent.
Another response might be, back in Jesus' days, that man came to Jesus and recognized who he was and said,
Yeah.
Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. In our day, in our ministry context, there are not a lot of people coming to the church for help.
Yep. And we'll be talking about that a little bit further as we move forward. Yeah. And obviously he had developed a reputation by now, so he was known. And obviously had powers that were unusual to their day, that they had not seen before. Any other just thoughts or reflections on this?
You mentioned about not being outside of the realm of being able to be helped. Pastor and I went to a conference on gender and sexuality that the Covenant gave at a church in Michigan last month. And the person spoke, and even the thing about seeing someone where they are and becoming compassionate, the person that spoke was coming out of that community and basically told what it was like to be in kindergarten. It was the first time I'd really felt like what it was like to be in someone like that shoes. And it changed my whole attitude about, he was kind of saying, are these people beyond being saved? And when you say the least of these, it kind of sometimes has been, I think, where they've stood in our worldview.
Good. Excellent. Okay, any other just thoughts on that? So with this, I think we all agree, and I think that's part of the reason why you're here, is this is really core to the heart of God. This is always the posture that He holds towards those whom He loves. And so what I want to now move us forward into is, how does this then represent itself and play itself out in the life of our congregations, and how we define and understand our mission, and how we live into that more faithfully on behalf of Christ. Well, to start with, I think there's always value in definition. And so the fourth marker is transforming communities through compassion, mercy, and justice ministries. And so the first definition that I just offered to you is a definition on the word transform, the root of transformation. And the definition of transform is to make a thorough or dramatic change in the form, appearance, or character of something else or someone else. Okay? Some synonyms for the word transform are change, alter, adapt, convert, metamorphose. And so we can see even in this one word that we're talking about substantial movement and change. This isn't just little steps, but this is dramatic. And in this context of this particular marker, it's talking about and directing the attention of transformation at a community level. But I also want to just invite us in to recognize the fact that whenever God moves us forward and calls us to step into new place, in new relationships and new circumstances, I think God also intends on transforming us as well. And so it's not just about those who we maybe are drawn and called to on behalf of Christ, that this marker has impact and transformational potential, because it's also things that God maybe wants to do and accomplish further in our own lives, in our understanding of who He is and who He's calling us to do and be in the world. Well, a second definition then is the term compassion. And in the covenant, we like to talk about compassion as positioning ourselves to help hurting people when we identify that there are hurting people around us. And consistent with the text that I already referred to, it's helping to both identify their pain, but drawing that pain even into our own heart, so that it compels us to a place of wanting to respond on their behalf. Because as I stated earlier, compassion still demands an action, a response from us. Justice, in terms of definition, we would contrast that and say justice is about when people are hurting, it's identifying what are the things that are causing the hurt in people and trying to eliminate or stop those things that are causing the actual hurt in people's lives. And so a framing question is, what is it that God's would desire here? How would God's will manifest itself if He stepped into this hurting circumstance on behalf of others? And it's identifying those activities that would lead to the actual accomplishment of His will being manifested into that situation, as well as recognizing that as His followers, God has a set of standards that He holds towards us as His people, and He also has a general set of standards and hopes that He carries for all of humanity. And the opportunity that we're given as His followers is not only to discern how that might manifest itself, but then we're invited to also consider being part of the process in actualizing and making that transformation happen for those who are experiencing the pain we see them in. Well, just for further understanding, and I apologize because of the printed form, these are pretty small in your book. But this is just two contrasting columns to identify some other dynamics that differentiate compassion from justice. And as it relates to compassion, it's about relieving and responding to human need, human circumstance. It also has to do with ministering both to individuals and families if the whole family system is affected by the pain. It also doesn't tend to respond and look at systems that maybe are causing pain, but it's just responding to the pain that people are experiencing. A biblical example of compassion might be the Good Samaritan. And we know that story well. But he responded to the man on the road. He didn't respond to what caused the man to be beaten on the road and the circumstance that he found him in. But his response was specific to the man. He saw that the man was cared for. Well, some other ministry examples of compassionate response of communities and the church are things like tutoring programs that get set up within school systems or outside of school systems where maybe students are found lagging in some core academic skills. It can be volunteer service in feeding ministries, in shelter kinds of ministries. It can be volunteering and providing support for homeless people that find themselves in that life circumstance. Visiting the elderly. These are all types of ministries that would be classified as compassion-based ministries. In contrast, justice is centering our attention on actually removing the causes of what is creating the human hurt and need that we are observing. And it's actually seeking in time and trying to discern through Holy Spirit presence and work in our lives what would be required to actually transform structures or systems that maybe are causing ongoing pain in individuals around us. And it's about addressing systemic and broader issues that are impacting more than an individual or a community, but maybe extends broadly throughout the whole community. A biblical example of justice, I think, is Moses. As Moses is set apart and called to confront Pharaoh on the behalf of the people of Israel, and tells Pharaoh, it's time for you to let my people go. Because God saw His people in a place that no longer was good for them, and God had a plan to take them, obviously, to a better place. And He used Moses as His advocate and voice to confront the Pharaoh and the system that was holding them in slavery, to begin that process of setting a stage, of moving God's people from where they were in slavery, eventually to the promised land that they were promised. Well, some other examples of justice-type ministries that you may have participated or be aware of. Some of those things can be lobbying whether it's lobbying with school boards or with legislatures to address shortcomings or reform kinds of needs in some of the public service or educational services of the community. It can actually be building low-cost housing units that then are made available for underemployed or even homeless individuals to break that cycle of homelessness. It can be launching a racial righteousness education plan and strategy to help people move beyond the dynamics of racism that are so continuing to paralyze and impact our experience as a whole nation because of our history in this area. So these are the kinds of things that we've seen develop. And the covenant also has some additional initiatives that both have national and international scope. I don't know how many of you are familiar with AVA, Advocates for Victims of Abuse. But that's another initiative that covenant churches have started to live into and really stand in the gap between those who are being abused and those who are abusing, and trying to break those cycles. There's also efforts that are being done in the area of human trafficking, both through the covenant and broader parachurch and international organizations like International Justice Mission. I think of the Paul Carlson Partnership that you may or may not be familiar with, but their primary initiative right now is focusing on the medical needs in Congo, and they are trying to rebuild the medical clinic infrastructure of the whole country of Congo, and they're inviting churches to actually adopt a clinic and see that that clinic is built, staffed, and supplied to effectively start to respond to all of the health needs that are represented in the Congo. So these are some other examples that have emerged even in the greater covenant denomination and churches pursuing on behalf of the denomination in these justice causes. So compassion, responding to pain, justice, trying to identify and eliminate those things that are actually causing the continued pain in others. Other thoughts, either in terms of helping us differentiate these two responses, compassion and justice, or other examples that maybe you are familiar with or maybe even participating in right now.
One of the things our church is doing in Mount Vernon, Washington, is we've got a mission, Children of the Valley, and it's just started small out of our church, and now it's gotten bigger, and it's mostly grant funded, but it's on beside our property, and it addresses and identifies the lowest income families in Mount Vernon, which are virtually all Hispanic families, and provides an after-school program of nurture, and it brings in, right now I think there's like 50 children and probably 40 volunteers and maybe 2 or 3 staff.
Wow.
And it's very exciting. You know, the challenge is how to have a little more integration into our church community.
Yep.
And the cool thing about that is that it is a way that the church is being reflective of our community, and the community is seeing our church as being active and intentional. It's always on the cusp for financial help and whatnot, but and we're starting to see, it's been going for 10 years, so we're starting to see these students graduate very successfully and move on to college.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any others?
When you started talking about the compassion and the difference between compassion and justice, I started thinking about the stuff that has the more new things that we've done lately. And I realized the compassion comes first, and then they do go to the justice, because we have a gal who was trafficked when she was a girl, and that's close to her heart. And so when her daughter got to be the age she was when she was trafficked, they kind of formed this organization to educate about it because she was compassionate about it. And then that led to going to the legislature and lobbying for laws. And then she found out that Covenant had their own thing, and so then she joined with that. And so it's just grown and grown and grown. But it all started from that compassion of her knowing what happened. And then the same thing, we have this homeless coalition that started out with a couple who had worked with a lot of homeless people through a laundry ministry. They go to the laundry and they pay for, everybody can have 2 loads of laundry, and they do this themselves, right? And so it started as compassion, and now our church has a whole task force working to eliminate all of these things and come up with temporary housing, all these things. And but it starts with the compassion, and then it kind of grows into the justice.
Yeah, and thank you for even offering that reflection, because I think that's very common. And part of that is, and I didn't highlight, but the reality is, and it's to differing degrees, but sometimes when we move into justice, it can move us to harder places, more uncomfortable places, and at times even controversial places, even in the life of either the community or our church body. But when it starts at a compassion level, where it's responding to individual needs, but out of that, relationships get formed. Suddenly, I'm drawn to a reflection that was written up in World Vision magazine years and years ago. But the president at that time, he wrote an article, and the title of the article is the only thing I remember. Poverty with a Name. And basically, through the whole article, he was encouraging the broader church to recognize that it's one thing to understand a concept, that there are poor people. It moves to a whole new place in both our life and our imagination when it takes on the name of someone we know. And that's why compassion always becomes the entry point. But then as we get to know these people and know their stories, and as stories start to repeat themselves around the same circumstance that one person is experiencing, others are experiencing, we're much more compelled on their behalf to move to some of these harder places that start to address maybe some of the systems kinds of issues that initially we were or weren't even aware of. But we're drawn to it out of commitment to those relationships. Yeah, excellent. Other things that people are aware of or have been involved with, just as examples for the group.
Well, this is really minor, but we have a very small church, and I had the call to go on a mission trip. And when I came back, I had gone to Kenya and came back, it bothered me that in 21 days, we had worked with 4,600 children, and very, very few had shoes. And it's very simple to think, well, that is something we can do. I mean, it's simple, 5-year flip. But in 3 shoe drives, we have raised over 3,900 pairs of shoes that we've shipped out. And it's a very simple thing. It doesn't cost anybody anything. It's either in your closet or you go down to the Dollar General. But it's a way of starting. And I now see people, and we collect from other churches in the area. But people say, when I'm saving my shoes, when are you going to have your dog? So it started mushrooming into, we're thinking of helping.
Excellent. Well, the reality is that this possibility we are surrounded by all the time. And even as I started, it really does begin just with a general sense of awareness. And I will confess, there are days where I go through my daily life patterns and I can be pretty oblivious to my surroundings. But I think it's every time that we allow God to just open up our eyes, or maybe move a little bit slower, or maybe go a different pattern and direction than we always go, that allows us to see a different part of our community or a different part of our city, that sometimes it's just those simple steps that God can use as seedbed for fresh invitation to say, be my witness and be my love in the world. and see what is really out there as a place that you can potentially stand. Well, Heidi Unruh is a person who's done a lot of research, writing, training, working with congregations in this whole area of compassion and justice ministries. And there's a number of resources that I have included of hers in the resource set of pages that I have given to you, as well as she was co-author of one of the core books that are on the bibliography I gave you, Churches That Make a Difference. But she provides these insights as it comes to what are the kinds of dynamics that help fuel and foster further movement and growth in compassion and justice ministries within congregations. Because she says this, as she works with churches, here's the general tendency within churches, that despite a genuine desire to share and to be God's loving presence in their community, many churches, she feels, stumble from the transition from intention to direct action, to actually follow through. She says there's a gap that often surfaces between intention and implementation, and actually between faith and action. And so what she has found over time is that these 5 components become significant elements in helping to accelerate congregations' ability to move into actually actions of compassion and justice within their community. The first thing she says, there needs to be a sufficient foundation of health and leadership within the congregation. And if you've been introduced to vision, intention, and means through Veritas, this point right here really talks about the vision and intention capacity of a local congregation. But obviously there has to be some leadership and some imagination, some vision around, is God hoping and expecting more of us? And if so, what might that be? And just opening the congregation up to that possible question. The second thing she says is that oftentimes, like your mission trip, it became a catalyst to a follow-up ministry and a response. So sometimes it's literally a change moment that presents itself, that someone in the congregation or the leadership actually does observe and see, and it's compelling them to invite the congregation to a place of response. Well, I want to share with you the story or the reflection of one church where they had a couple of these kind of catalyzing moments for changing their posture in response to the community. This is a church in our conference, Carmel Covenant Church. It's a town and country church. And we did this video a few years back when Pastor Alan Johnson was the pastor there. And just listen to their story in terms of what God saw them seeing in new and fresh ways and how they responded as a congregation. If I can get this up. Come on. There we go. Here we go. Oh, what in the world? I think I got to drag it. Got it? Come on. There we go. Sorry.
I think that outreach is so critical to the vitality of a church. When you can begin to envision your people, show them that God has gifted them and given them wonderful abilities to do outreach, and then begin to provide opportunities. It doesn't happen overnight, but over a period of several years, it really energizes the church. We have spent some years trying to encourage our people to dare to risk and dare to experiment. One day, one of the older ladies of our congregation came to me and she said, I don't know if this has any possibility, but there's an organization called Pathways, and they do respite care for people with dementia. They're looking for a setting. Is that something we could host here? And we met with the Pathways representatives. They were hesitant because they had never taken this program to a rural church setting before. And I said, well, all you have to do is look around and know that we've got as much dementia around us here as anywhere else. I mean, it's a widespread issue in our society. So after some organizational meetings, we began to launch. And it has been just a tremendous experience for the entire congregation. I think that partnering is one of the really, really great things smaller or rural congregations can do. You don't have to invent the wheel. You just have to find other people who want to work with you to do the things that you want to accomplish. I visited a local food pantry and was talking to the director there. I was looking around at the almost empty shelves, cans and boxes, and we at my house were enjoying all the produce of our garden, so I just said, do you ever get anything fresh in here? And the director got all excited about that. He said, boy, we could sure use some fresh stuff. So we decided to have a church garden dedicated exclusively to serving the needs of our local food pantries. It's about the size of a football field. We have over 30 people working in the garden. The response of the people of this congregation has really been wonderful. It doesn't require skills that are foreign to who we are. It's the most contextualized ministry a rural church could ever have. We need to see ministries as, in some way, experiments that we're going to try together. No such thing as failure. The only way to fail is to try nothing. But we see these as experiments rather than standing programs that have to be around 20 or 30 years from now in order to be called a success. Even if they only happen once or twice or 3 times, the fact that we did something really, really matters. In the Message translation of the New Testament, Eugene Peterson says, never throw water on a friendly bonfire. And I think of that all the time. When people come with ideas, I think, well, here's a friendly bonfire. I'm not going to throw any water on it. I'm going to fan it and see if something can come from this. It's exciting for the whole church.
What'd you hear?
You don't have to go it alone.
Don't have to go it alone. Excellent. What else?
Don't be afraid to fail.
Don't be afraid to fail. And isn't that kind of a knee-jerk response that often surfaces in doing life together in churches? We're so afraid of failure. Yeah, I just love that posture that just says, what is the only failure, he says? Doing nothing, trying nothing. Yeah. Other things that you respond to, or?
Building things which you already know.
Yeah.
The farming community with the garden.
Yeah. And it's just amazing to see this in motion. All of these people, putting in their time on this in this massive garden for their local food shelf network. It's just so wonderful to watch when it's in action. Other things that you maybe heard or draw.
About that I like branching off of what Jon was talking about last night and finding your giftedness and feeling like you're a kid in a candy store when you're living into your giftedness.
Yeah.
And one of the things connected with our Children of the Valley, we have a master gardener who's created a community garden. This reminded me of in the back, and he is building junior master gardeners from these COV kids, and then they're taking baskets of food home, and then it's going to the local food bank. But Andy is just a happy gardener.
Yeah.
And he's bringing happy gardeners with him.
Right.
And turning children into happy gardeners. So it's not like this big task.
Yes.
And I thought, seeing those elderly folks in that wonderful pot of soup, I like, even if they just shared one meal together, that was successful.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like they have to have, obviously they need vision, but that idea of having some big program that we have to commit to
Right.
can be paralyzing.
Right.
And or it can be small and
Well, I like how she says you kind of have to be brave, because it reminded me of Share the Harvest. I don't know if any of the other Washington churches, did you do the Share? Who else is in Washington? Did you guys do Share the Harvest?
Remind me.
Okay, there's a church in Spokane that got this crazy idea that because they were in a farming community, they have a bunch of farmers that go to that church who grow apples. And they came to them one day and said, hey, we have this idea, we got all these apples we grow every year, and we could donate a bunch of them, and you could sell 10 pounds for $10 and send all of the proceeds to the experimental church or experimental farm in Congo we have that
Yeah.
does okay.
Yeah.
And we won't charge you for the apples. We'll bring them in. All you have to do is have people to pack them up and sell them, and you can have all the profits. And it was a crazy idea, you know. And they were like, okay, you know, let's try it. So they did it one year, and it was huge. So then some of the other churches that weren't even covenant churches wanted to do it the next year. So it grew. And that was only Spokane. But then the year we had annual conference at our church for this conference, they came and they did a little presentation, and a whole bunch of the churches from the conference then participated. So all they had to do was get to Spokane, do them, and we just did it last week. I mean, we got our apples last week. And it's amazing how crazy ideas can grow if you're willing to try it once.
Yes. And you'll notice that the fourth point here that Unruh identifies is identified direction for mission. And you know, sometimes mission does come through intentional discernment and planning. But what I like in this video and other examples that have already been represented, sometimes mission just shows up to us. And then have we cultivated the kind of community value that says, yes, at times we plan and we execute a plan, but at times God shows up through His Spirit and says, hey, guess what? This isn't in your plan, but I have a plan for you. Are you willing to step into it and still be found faithful? And so it can be both and. And to me, that's one of the great dynamics and adventures of ministry and doing life together. So sometimes it's discerned and planned and executed with clear direction. Sometimes it's an opportunity that presents itself that we weren't even thinking about, but then as it presents, we discern, but we can still stand in this need and respond. The third point that she talks about is obviously resources ministries require resources, whether it's human or time or money. And so we do want to be aware of what are the resources that we have. And one of the things that I've seen developed by some congregations is similar to what business does around research and development. They set aside in their annual budget what they refer to as an R&D fund. And what that is a set amount of money, and it has to be, discerned and determined through congregational process. But it's undesignated funds, so that when these Holy Spirit moments present themselves, there doesn't have to be 3 layers of committee meetings and process in order for us to step into those opportunities. If there's just this deep sense, God literally is asking us to move into this place.
We call it emerging needs.
Say that again?
We call it emerging needs.
Emerging Need Fund, okay. But that's one approach of actually structurally anticipating that God wants to surprise us sometimes, and that positions us better to even respond, because ministry does cost. And this helps us be a little bit more adaptable and flexible, particularly when those moments present themselves that are unplanned for. Then the last thing that she talks about is that there needs to be also built or developed within the life of the congregation individuals who will continue to help sustain mission movement forward. Because it's one thing to say yes and step into a ministry or a mission. It's another thing to follow that through to completion, or in some cases, ministries have no ending. Because if you step into some places of need, these needs are going to be presenting themselves for a long time. Scripture even makes reference to the fact the poor will always be with you. Now that's not a celebration from God's vantage point, but I think it's an honest assessment that we can anticipate that there are going to be poor among us, and therefore, what would God require of us when we become aware of them and their needs, and how might we respond? Oh, I wonder why. Thank you for telling me that. Why is it not projecting? Ah, I'm very sorry. Lower tech still, even though. Yeah, thank you. So anyway, Unruh just offers that as some insight into how are we fostering and developing and creating congregational culture and system that is potentially positioned to step into and sustain quality, compassion, mercy, and justice ministries as God so leads and directs us towards that. Rick Russo and Eric Swanson wrote a book called Externally Focused Churches. It is on the bibliography, and I have a copy over on the counter there. It's a wonderful work in terms of helping congregations continue to live into and unpack and further develop a biblical appreciation and understanding for the fact that, as I started out, the church isn't just the gathered of people, but it's the gathered of people sent on mission, gathered people of God sent on mission. Well, one of the things that they offer in this book, just for some further insight in trying to understand how the church steps and lives into a more transformational model of ministry, is this construct. And you've maybe seen one similar if you've been on the pathway, because we also introduce a construct called the Vision Intersection Profile that uses this same three-circle integration. But this is how Russo and Swanson presented, just as a point of reference and perspective. You have one circle that continues to live into and develops a deeper understanding for the mandates and the desires that God has towards the world and the human community, and the potential of God's people living into that. The second circle represents the needs and dreams of the community where God has uniquely placed you. And the third circle is then specific to your congregation. What is your sense of calling and capacity as a congregation to live into, or live more fully into, compassion and justice ministries? And what Russo and Swanson say is one of the better places to begin to discern and step into ministry is at this point of intersection of the three circles, where there is a presented need, there's a capacity and a sense of alignment around mission and purpose with the church, as well as alignment around God's hope and dreams for humanity as well as for His church in relationship to humanity. And they say that is oftentimes a better place to start if you can discern this intersection. The reason being is motivation becomes less of a factor in terms of helping your people capture a vision for their potential of stepping into this place of ministry. Does that make sense? And so it's an assessment and a discernment process. And one of the things that you'll realize and recognize is embedded throughout the whole congregational vitality. One of the things that we say is evaluation and assessment also are normal and natural rhythms of healthy organizations. Because the reality is, around all factors of ministry, there's an ongoing responsibility of leaders to both discern and assess and then help lead a congregation forward into what it is that God is calling them to uniquely be to their context and beyond. Yeah, please.
We know that one of the things God wants us to do is care for broken people.
Yes.
In a community around our church is surrounded by broken people, broken families, substance abuse recovery, people like that.
Yes.
And so that's what does God want us to do, what does the community need us to do, and then we get what are we able to do.
Yep.
And there's a couple of peer recovery coaches connected to our church, so now they have open, like, drop-in center, Monday through Wednesday, 10 to 2,
Excellent.
because we can do it.
Yeah, excellent. Well, and I want to use that as a segue because in this broader construct, Heidi Unruh and others, they really invite us then into further understanding of the levels of assessment and the levels of discernment that can help us create better convergence of all of the variables and components, both community-wide and congregational, to help create better alignment and greater potential for fruitfulness as we go through that discernment process. And I just want to unpack this briefly, and then we're going to have more conversation. So the three things are there has to be some congregational assessment that's ongoing. And in this context, as it relates to the potential of Compassion, Mercy, and Justice Ministries, there also needs to be good community assessment so that we're discerning well what are the real or felt needs or the hopes and dreams of the community, so we aren't imposing our imagination, but we're actually responding to what the community has identified as valued and needed. Okay? And then thirdly, based on those two assessments, how do we ultimately discern what is the best place for us right now in this moment as a congregation to step into and begin to live into in ministry? On the community or the congregational assessment, this is just a little bit expanded to some of the factors that Unruh identified in those 5 components for change. But it's discerning, how does potential Compassion and Justice Ministries fit into our understanding of our overall call, as you were just reflecting, that part of our call is we are to respond to broken people. And we understand that, and that aligns well with our heart sense of what God is positioning and preparing us to do. So it's alignment with a sense of call and our mission and our guiding values and determining is there good alignment that we sense here. Obviously, leadership is critical at any level of congregational life. And so as you're exploring and discerning new possibilities, ultimately the leaders are going to also have to see this as consistent with where they sense God is leading the church. The fourth area is a set of competencies. Are there already some unique or some standing skills or experiences that already God has placed in your congregation, and as you start to assess community needs, you start to see alignment because you already have people that have some of the skills or resources that are necessary to respond to those needs. And then I'm going to drop down to the last one, and this is just one that sometimes we forget, and that is this issue of duplication. And sometimes, because even Alan Johnson in the little video, one of the things that he referenced is sometimes it's better to come alongside of others than to begin something ourselves if there's already someone standing in that place. And I don't know an agency or a ministry who turns down volunteers that want to help advance their mission. You know what I'm saying? And so sometimes we have to even fight against some of our own internal parochialism or whatever it is, where we think we have to do it in order for God to get credit for it. And that's just not true. And in fact, some of the greater, especially justice ministries, and some of them I alluded to, The only reason they're being so successful is because it's a whole network of partnerships that are coming together to actually have the strength to address and break into these massive systems that continue to hurt and alienate people. And it's the strength of the partnership that even gives them capacity to do those things. So always ask yourself, if we step in this, are we duplicating, or are there others that are already doing it and they're doing it well and they'd love to have some more volunteers join their team? Okay? So there's this congregational assessment. And then there's this level of community assessment. And how many of you done some community assessment work? Not too many. Okay? In your resource pages, there is also a page regarding a service that the covenant denomination and your conferences subscribe to. It's an online demographic service called Mission Insight. If you aren't familiar with it, I strongly encourage you to become familiar and contact your conference office, because they will grant you an access code where you can then get direct access to this online resource. And what Mission Insight has done is not only continued to grow in their overall utilization of broad demographic resources, but they've also continued to grow in helping as congregations begin to translate and missionalize that information into your context. And it's so flexible and adaptable where you literally can draw the radius or the distance around your church that you want more information, and it will only give you information based on the boundary that you create. So that is a service that already does a lot of this good discernment work for you, and I really strongly encourage you to pursue that. But what are some other kind of quantitative resource data that you can draw out of a community, just to get a better understanding for both what's happening in the community and maybe some of its presenting needs?
There's going to be a community foundation, health
Yes.
department,
Yes.
Local governmental units, townships, villages.
Excellent.
Local churches.
School district, churches.
Legislators.
Yes, excellent. Law enforcement as well, yes. Okay? So that's one source, just getting some quantitative data and some of the indicators that data presents. But then there's qualitative data. Data that also gives more observations and impressions and maybe emerging values or insights into real experiences that people are having. And again, Mission Insight does some of this work, but there's other tangible things that you can do. A few of those I've placed also in your resource pages, but sometimes it's just simple neighborhood interviews, both with leaders in the community as well as neighbors in the community. Sometimes it can be facilitating focus groups around an issue that already is surfacing in the community, but there's not a lot of people talking about it yet. And the church can be the impetus to help facilitate and use those as ways of gaining further insight into the kinds of presenting needs or hopes and dreams that might be surfacing new in your community. And the reason for all of this is to eventually lead to a place of discerning missional direction. And hear me loud and clear, because this is true with also, and John spoke to it briefly this morning, strategic ministry plans. This isn't about just developing a plan and saying, wow, that was nice, and now we know more about our community. But it makes no difference in terms of us living faithfully into our mission. this is actually helping us move beyond that gap that Heidi Unruh talks about between intention and implementation. And actually looking for ways to see how does this link and connect with the potential heart and bubbling passions of our own congregation. And maybe God is providing us some fresh window or pathway of entry into the congregation. So do the level of assessment that works for you. But don't allow the assessment to become so demotivating or so energy draining that you never get to the more important phase, which is the discernment and implementation phase. Okay? I can't stress that enough, because it's about action. And all of this other stuff is, even as I alluded in our meditation, are the launching pad to actually us living into and responding to the community. So here are just some further framing questions to help on the discernment side, as we have done some assessment at a congregational level and we've done some assessment at a community level. How is God already at work in the community? And may that be a point of entry, partnership, instead of starting something new. Who was it? It was Blackaby. Yeah. Identify where God's already at work and maybe just get in line and help out instead of starting something new. It's a great foundational missional principle. Secondly, what aspects of community life call for transformation by God's holy love? I mean, are there some deep holes or spaces that uniquely it's God's people that can step into and fill, because we bring Christ and His love into the equation and into the circumstance. Keep our antenna up, because that might be a unique place that God might call us to stand. And what would God's intended wholeness look like in our community based on some of the needs that we are identifying, and based on that vision of a whole community, a healthy community, a thriving community? Does it start to surface some potential elements that we again could see ourselves aligning and playing a part in making that happen? Okay, so these are just some further discerning questions as you move from assessment to try and evaluate and begin to discern and develop a potential vision and understanding for what God might be uniquely placing you as a church to step into. And then lastly, before we have some time for conversation, then it's out of the discernment at the community level, it's also discerning at a church level this alignment piece in all the critical aspects that are going to position you to either step into a ministry that's going to require long-term sustaining support and development and leadership, or it's a timeline ministry and you have already identified that it uniquely aligns and you're positioned well in terms of resources and leadership to step into and live that out to its completion. Okay? So it's this process of assessing and discerning based on your context and your people, and what is it that God might be uniquely positioning you then to step into. As Pastor Allen said, no, not to be afraid, but just step into, and even say initially this is just an experiment, but we sense that God's maybe opening this door or revealing it to us, so let's give it a try. And then our commitment back to the congregation is, as we try things, we are also committed to, once we live out the cycle of that initiative, you can be confident we're going to evaluate. And we're going to assess, does it make sense for us to continue to live further in this ministry? Or did we learn some things, and were there some assumptions that we made that weren't accurate, and therefore the outcome was different than we had anticipated and doesn't really align with who we sense God wants us to be? And so we lay it to rest and reposition and open ourselves up to new possibilities moving forward. And I hope you recognize and understand that for organizations and for congregations, one of leaders' greatest friends is positive momentum. And so really, even when it comes to discerning and living into compassion, mercy, and justice ministries, part of what you're trying to do is you're trying to build up the compassion, mercy, justice muscles of your congregation. And part of the way that muscle grows is just through exercise. It's doing it. And as you do it, more and more people will maybe gain greater appreciation and understanding for it. And it starts to build that positive momentum that, in response to the culture question or definition that Jon likes to use, how do we do life around here? We'll put it in this context. How do we do compassion, mercy, and justice ministries around here? This is how we do it. And there's living example and people that can bring testimony to how that has both transformed others, but in the process, transformed them as well. Okay? I want to open it up for questions, comments, further thoughts.
There was I've worked in international missions for about 10 years.
Okay.
There was a real focus. Most of our works were trying to meet needs, and we couldn't even really focus on sustainable church models.
Okay.
Where there would be a trained leader who had full salary. So a lot of the energy was aimed at meeting felt needs in the community. Since then, I've noticed, I live and work in Canada now.
Okay.
And one of our pastors there has been talking a lot about not assessing what needs are in the community as much as what assets there are in the community. And so it overlaps a little bit with appreciative inquiry.
Yes.
And so it's really interesting, the thought. I live in a neighborhood of 65,000 people.
Okay.
And one of the questions that we're trying to prayerfully work through is just simply, there's 65,000 people here, there has to be a tremendous amount of asset in terms of human capital. So what are those gifts? What are those abilities? What are the resources in terms of time that can be used for not, I don't even want to say meeting needs, but just be used for building the neighborhood.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and it is a shift, and I apologize because that was actually my oversight, because I also wanted to reinforce that it's not just needs, but it is assets. And assets sometimes are even just the dreams of the community that are about building and continuing to try and set a stage for a more thriving and healthy community. And even biblically, a great illustration of starting with what we have, our assets, is Jesus' feeding of the 5,000. And if you remember the brief discourse with the disciples, eventually the day was prolonging, and Jesus had been teaching, and the disciples come to him and they're concerned, they're worried, they're anxious. These people are getting tired and hungry. How are we going to feed them all? And their message to Jesus is, we can't do that. We don't have enough here to feed. And what was Jesus' framing question to the disciples? Go, yeah, what do we have? Go find out what we have, and then let's see what God will do. And obviously it was a profound miracle. But I think that's illustrating exactly what you're talking about, is the importance of recognizing that every community also has assets. And maybe that becomes the primary foundation, that becomes the launching pad for us to engage in direct service or ministry with them. Yeah, excellent. Other reflections and thoughts?
This discussion now reminds me of an article I read from a pastor. He titled it, "The Day Our Church Stopped Helping People."
Ah.
And they had hired a pastor who just walked around in the neighborhood and listened to people's stories and learned about who they were and what they had to offer. And he invited the community people into ministry, helping each other, instead of seeing them as the needy.
Yeah, excellent. That's excellent. What was the name of the article again?
Sorry.
Okay. That's kind of like me, hunger with a name. I think that was the title, but I'm not sure.
The day we stopped.
Yeah,
The day we stopped helping. Okay. Excellent. Other thoughts?
Remember celebrate the things that your church does that are small, that you wouldn't think necessarily are a big ministry, but we have a small country church with, we're lucky, 75 to 100 people show up. But we partner with Salvation Army for their food bank.
Mm-hmm.
We partner with our local pregnancy care center. We do Project Mary at Christmas, and we do shoe boxes and homeless shelter. We don't have a, working together with the other local churches in our area, we have found a church that is willing to let them set up a homeless shelter, a permanent shelter for nighttime shower, sleeping, supper. And it runs through the winter months, through the cold months, and different churches staff it, bring in the meal for that night. But it's, does our church do great big community thing? Not by itself, no.
Mhm.
But we're involved in so much, and it's important to celebrate those things, I think, with the people in your church, to make it known what they do.
Yeah, what you just said I think is really important. Because I don't think we celebrate enough, and I don't think we tell story enough. And oftentimes it's embedded in the real life story that reinforces the transforming work that the church is really doing and builds further that momentum collectively within the congregation. For those that are already participating, it only motivates them further. For those that aren't yet, it maybe starts to spin in their mind the question, well, maybe I should get involved, or maybe the next opportunity I ought to sign up and be a part of this, because I can see how important this is in even understanding my own faith and being faithful in living that out. So
And it's okay if it's a different denomination.
certainly, absolutely. Absolutely. Partnerships can be broad, and they can be secular and religious partnerships as well. I think they can be very broad if they share common vision and purpose and value. Yes. Any other reflections? Well, again, I offered you some further resource pages, and there are continued growing resources available. One of the pages also introduces you to, if you haven't already, there's an online curriculum that's been created by Love, Mercy, Do Justice Department of the Covenant Church. It's excellent, and I encourage you to use that maybe as a further teaching training tool for your congregations. But there's many resources that are included there, and I just encourage you to continue to find ways of fostering this marker into the full life and ministry expression of your church. And I hope as you're being introduced to all 10 of these markers, you're seeing and starting to sense how holistic and how full, but how biblically centered they all are in instructing us to better understand how do we live out this mission that God has handed off to us and asked us to steward well, and actually do that. Steward it well by living further in all of these markers in their fullness of expression. So with that, let me just offer a word of prayer, and then I'll give quick instruction to our transition here. So, Father God, thank you for each one represented here in their congregations, and thank you for this brief time that you've allowed us to just reflect further on your heart and your hope and your response to the world, and how that directly connects to us and your church. And I just pray that you will continue to bless and guide each of these pastors and leaders in their congregations to be open to and continue to press forward in pursuing their place, their unique and special place of being your faithful witness to their communities and beyond, as we extend your great grace and love and compassion to the whole world. So bless us, I pray, in the name of Christ. Amen.